for the Shelton City Council on September 17th, 2009. We'll start with the pledge. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. And I'll turn it over to City Manager Knighton.
Thank you. Get this situated here. I'm not used to starting so early. Thank you very much, Mr. Mayor, members of council. Tonight, we wanted to present several ideas to you about the legislative session in 2020, and then participate in a discussion about our legislative agenda. Next steps after the discussion this evening will be developing a resolution for council's approval for the legislative agenda in 2020. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to our lobbyist, Troy Nichols, who will run through a PowerPoint real quick, some information you've seen before, some of it's relatively new, and then we can get into the discussion.
All right, Jeff, thank you very much. Appreciate the invite to come speak to you tonight. Wanted to run through a quick PowerPoint presentation. I think that my eyes were a lot bigger than my stomach when I put this together. So I'm gonna race through this pretty quick, but please feel free to interrupt with any questions or concerns or clarifications. This is now, we're heading into our third session working together. And it's amazing how time flies that quick. But I know most of you have been through my little budgeting 101 session at least once, and so a lot of this will be old news to you. I've condensed the presentation, updated a few of the slides just to get the juices flowing and the discussion going. So we'll go ahead and start in on this. Is there a secret to how you?
Oh, just left click.
Oh,
Is it working?
it's just a mouse.
Yeah. There we go.
There- Pushed it in. Oh, is that me?
That's you.
Well, how do you do next slide? Oh, there we go. Okay, real quick, the goal for today is, as Jeff stated, begin an informed discussion about the city's 2020 legislative priorities. So we'll go through a brief budgeting 101 overview, explain some of the differences between the short and long sessions. We're heading into a short session in 2020 in January. We'll have a general political and policy outlook for 2020. So there's been some changes in the legislature, and there may be some issues that come up. We'll talk about those, but then we'll really get into the heart of the matter, which is our discussion with you about what you would like to prioritize and make your priorities for the 2020 legislative session. Just real quick, you guys know me pretty well. Just a little bit about my background. I joined Brad Tower and took over Phillips Burgess back in June of 2017. We represent about 14 different clients in Olympia. Most of them are business related, but we do have some public entities like the City of Shelton, ESD 113, which is the local ESD that represents the school districts in Mason County. I moved up to Washington State in 2007 to become the state director of NFIB. Was the policy director for the House Republicans for 5 years, 5 sessions. Capital budget was one of my committee assignments too, so I'm fairly familiar with that. And then after leaving there, I was the executive officer of the Olympia Master Builders. Originally from Oregon, was on the city council in Kaiser, Oregon for 2.5 years, but worked at the state and federal levels in government as well. Whoops, let's see. Now the rollers decided to work. Okay, so 2018 was our first session working together. We scored 2 significant accomplishments. We did receive $1 million for the Downtown Connector project, and it was a good day going to that ribbon cutting just a few weeks ago. We also secured $288,000 in funds from the capital budget for the Shelton Timberland Library improvement. And then last session, we secured $650,000 for the Wallace Neelan Shelton Springs intersection. And we also received $283,000 for the Civic Center parking lot paving and recreational amenities next door here to the Civic Center. So quick budgeting 101, obviously there are 3 significant biennial budgets in the state of Washington: operating, transportation, and capital. You can see the sizes there. Operating gets most of the attention because it's the largest and it funds things like schools, state employees, that sort of thing. The transportation just shy of $10 billion this biennium. And then the capital budget just shy of $5 billion for the current biennium. This is very touchy. Okay. So just to give you a quick idea, and you've seen this slide before, of the things that the capital budget goes towards. It's pretty, it's a myriad of projects. The big chunk of funding out of the bond capacity with the state goes to fund public schools. That was over $1 billion this session, which I think is a modern day record. That's because local communities have been very successful in passing their bond levies for construction, and then the state comes in with a matching program for that. But it also covers things like parks and rec, wildlife habitat, low-income housing projects, social service centers, museums, cultural facilities, one of which will be coming into play here in Shelton with the YMCA project here in the near future. Community college, university buildings, you name it, it runs the gamut. So just to give you a little of a historical perspective, this is the size of the capital budget over the last 6 biennia. The light blue is the general obligation bond funded program projects. And then the dark blue, the capital budget has a series of revenue streams, everything from the model toxic control account to federal funds, to state funds that are raised off of the trust lands. Those are usually dedicated to certain programs, but the overall budget has gone up in the last couple of biennia. And the $3.18 billion in bonded funded projects is the most since the mid-2000s, before the economic downturn. I know that print is a little bit hard to read, but one of the ways that we've received funding from the capital budget the last couple of sessions is through local and community projects. These are the projects that are delegation requests specifically. And we've enjoyed a very good partnership with our delegation. They have always submitted our requests the last 2 sessions, and they work together as a unit, and I think that has led to a lot of the success that we've seen. As you can see, I think the top part is the most relevant. You see the total amount for local community projects every biennium, and it's grown every year pretty substantially. But even more so, there's been more projects, as many as 298 this biennium, which is a lot. And so as a result, the average total for every project has gone down the last 4 biennia. That doesn't mean that significant projects in the millions of dollar range don't get funded, and you can see the range there at the end. And in fact, last biennium, Shelton had a pretty big one with the sewer project, the Basin 3. That was a $3 million appropriation that we secured, or that you secured. That was before my time. And then there's a process. You submit a form. We work with city staff, Mark and Craig and others, to fill out that form. We submit it to the delegation, and they turn it in for consideration. The transportation budget process is a little less formal, but it's also a little bit more difficult to be successful here, just because there are a lot of requests and very little money to go around. The gas tax is the primary driver of revenue for the transportation budget, and as you're probably well aware, that's becoming less and less of a revenue generator, and as much as 1/3 of that gas tax revenue, the budget, is being consumed by debt service on bonded projects. The State Department of Transportation has a 6-year highway construction planning cycle that they update every couple of years. And it used to be, prior to 1990, that they didn't really accept member requests or local projects outside of that list, but that's a relatively recent phenomenon over the last 30 years. Again, I won't bore you with these details because that's why you pay me to help you navigate this process, but you do member requests similar to the capital budget, and it has to include that list of items that are in the checklist. I underlined the most important one, the additional funds either secured or being pursued for the project. Any type of matching funds or community support that you can demonstrate, particularly in the transportation world, that greatly increases your ability to secure appropriations. So as long as the state isn't the last money in, it tends to increase your chances for success. And I know the 2 projects that we were able to secure funding for the last 2 sessions, there was a healthy match from the local community, and I think that made a lot of difference in getting what we needed. So as I mentioned earlier, we're heading into a short session. There are 60 days in the even-numbered years and 105 days. That was what we just emerged from in the odd-numbered years. In theory, so the voters approved a constitutional amendment in 1979 that went to annual sessions. And the theory at the time was that the short session would be meant really to only consider supplemental budgets, tweaks here and there to policy. But in practice, that's not really the case. Candidly, it's much like a long session with just into a much more condensed timeline. Especially last session where you had, in the 2018 session, you had a change in control in the Senate. There was a lot of pent-up legislative activity, so it was almost the same number of bills were introduced in that short 60-day session than in a typical 105-day session. Short sessions, the good news is they tend to adjourn on time. If you look over the last, since 2000, of the 10 short sessions, 6 of them have adjourned on time versus just 3 of the long sessions. They tend to go over time on the long ones. Although this year, session adjourned on time for the first time since 2009, so that was kind of a big deal. Part of the reason, candidly, why short sessions tend to adjourn on time is because members are anxious to get on the campaign trail. Even-numbered years are election years, and they can't raise money for campaigns while they're in session. 2020, the legislature convenes on January 13th. That date is set in statute. And then the typical cutoff calendar, I put some key dates there. The policy committee cutoff, so every bill has to be out of their respective policy committees by day 26. So really you have less than 4 weeks to get a bill out of committee. The House bills have to be passed over the Senate and vice versa by day 38, so that's less than 6 weeks. And then everything has to be through both houses except for budgets by day 54, and then you sine die on day 60. Just to give you get into some of the general political and policy outlooks for the 2020 session. This is the current makeup of both chambers. The Senate currently has 28 Democrats, 21 Republicans. They serve 4-year terms, and half of those seats are up for re-election in the year 2020. In the House, you have 57 Democrats versus 41 Republicans. They serve 2-year terms, and they all have to run for re-election every 2 years. There are 2 special elections that are going to be on the ballot for the legislature this November, but they are in fairly safe seats for the incumbent party, and so we don't expect those to change hands. So the makeup of the legislature as it is will continue to be that once we get in. One of the unique factors heading into the 2020 session is we're going to have a new House Speaker for the first time in almost 20 years. The House Democrats selected Representative Lori Jenkins from Tacoma to be the next Speaker of the House. The Speaker is technically elected by the entire body, so she can't officially assume the position until they vote her in when the legislature convenes on the 13th. Representative Jenkins, I have some fairly good interactions with her. We have clients that are situated in her district. She's very open, very candid. She's pretty tough and she's very smart. I think she'll do a pretty good job, but after 20 years of one type of leadership, I think people are waiting to see how she's going to govern, and she has all the tools to do a good job. I know that Speaker Chop, one of his mantras over the years was One Washington, and really was look out for his rule, Democratic members of his caucus. There are obviously fewer and fewer of those these days, but the ones that remain, we'll see how Speaker-elect Jenkins looks out for their interests once we get into session. Some of the major policy initiatives now in September of 2019, it's impossible to forecast exactly what's going to be on the agenda. Again, short session, want to get out on time, hit the campaign trail, but we do know that there's going to be a push for some gun control legislation based on some of the shootings that have occurred in other parts of the country. I know that's at top of the Attorney General's agenda, and there will at least be some consideration. And the reason why I bring that up is because those issues tend to be fairly divisive, and when you have those, it tends to put a damper on other less controversial issues proceeding through the process. The big question on everybody's minds is, are we going to see a capital gains tax? This has been a priority for the House Democratic Caucus for several sessions, and specifically newly elected Speaker Jenkins has introduced capital gains tax bills over the last several biennia. In the Senate, you had a resignation. Senator Guy Palumbo from the 1st District resigned to take a government affairs job with Amazon. His replacement was former State Representative Derek Sanford from the House, and he supports a capital gains tax, whereas Guy Palumbo did not. So based on everybody's informal vote counts, there are now the votes in the Senate, at least in theory, to pass that. So it depends on if they want to push that in a short session in an election year in the House for a new capital gains tax. That remains to be seen, and that's the question everybody's kind of looking out for. The other big issue that we can sort of waiting on the outcome for is Initiative 976. This is the Tim Eyman car tab, $30 car tab initiative. And the fiscal impact is pretty devastating if it passes. And I'm not advocating one way or the other, but just the raw numbers show a pretty significant gap of almost $2 billion this biennium and more in out biennium for transportation projects all over the state. And so if that were to pass, you would have to spend a significant amount of time next session dealing with the fallout from that because it is a pretty substantial hit to the current transportation budget. And then finally, I think, Senator Hobbs, he's the chair of the Transportation Committee in the Senate, put together his proposal, about $17 billion for transportation, put that on the table last session. It didn't really get very far, but these things do usually take multiple sessions to pass. And in a meeting with Representative Jake Fye, he's the chair of the House Transportation Committee, a couple of weeks ago, he told us that he was looking at putting together his own transportation package proposal for consideration next session. So how we fit into that, it remains to be seen what it looks like and who will be eligible for funding. It's still on the drawing board, but if there is significant effort in pushing those forwards, we'll be a part of those discussions. So that gets us to the meat of the agenda while we're here tonight for potential 2020 legislative priorities. I'll run through a few of these bullet points and then I'll turn it back over to Jeff because I know some of the items at the bottom of that list were put on the official docket for tonight. Just something to keep in mind for the 2020 supplemental capital budget. The total remaining bond capacity to spend next session is just $70 million. Now, based on my experience, that is a meager amount. Historically, there has been anywhere from 100 to up to 300 billion for in bond capacity left over for the supplemental. But going into this next session, you only have $70 million for the entire state. And to put that in perspective, that's only just shy of $1.5 million per legislative district. So when we're formulating our agenda and looking at the practicality of getting a lot of money out of the capital budget, just keep those numbers in mind. The other thing that we can anticipate is that the Shelton YMCA is going to have their own budget request for next session for the remaining $750,000 that they need to build the facility that they would like to build once things gets rolling. And I know our delegation has been supportive of that. The city has as well. But again, if they're going to be asking our members to bring that home, we might have to factor that into some of our decision making. And then again, the transportation package, one reason why I think that it might get legs or at least have a lot of discussion next session is it is literally the Association of Washington City's top priority for their 2020 session agenda. I don't know if you've seen that, but they published that, I believe, early this week or late last week. But that's number one on the list. And then one of the items that we did request last session but were not successful in securing was that Railroad Avenue Corridor Improvement Project. And then the amount was contingent upon Mason County's participation. And I'm not sure where we are with that, but I think we should at least have some discussion on that with staff. And then finally, just to throw this out there, it's at the very beginning stages, but the U.S. Navy has engaged WashDOT to start discussions about a commuter rail from Bremerton, hopefully all the way down here to Shelton. And they have asked for some information on the feasibility of that project. Apparently, there's, obviously, I don't have to tell you about the congestion on the highway, but even the parking and the shift changes and all that, it must be a real mess for the U.S. military to finally be actively engaged and willing to hopefully pony up some resources to make that a reality. But these things take time, and I know WashDOT has just started that discussion with the U.S. Navy. And then, Jeff, I'll turn it over to you, and you can talk about the last three, and then we can open it up for questions or comments.
Sounds good. And a few of the things that I've talked to the council about in our briefings. Number one is the latecomer agreement mitigation opportunities, if there are any, with the utility lines out to WSP. Something that I wanted to talk to council, or wanted to talk with council about, and if and when and how we should put that on our legislative agenda. Resources to address homelessness issues here in the city and in the surrounding community, broken down into a couple different parts. A policy direction, hopefully from the state, on how the city and other municipalities collectively will deal with the Martin v. Boise decision out of the federal courts. And then resources to address the problem through construction, with a homeless shelter construction potentially, and hopefully operational resources. Those things, even after the initial construction, aren't inexpensive to operate year over year. And lastly, the municipal government modernization initiatives. A couple things, well, one major thing I was thinking about there, which is probably not particularly a legislative ask, but would be the radio reads for our meters. And I know there are grant programs to deal with those types of things. And lastly, not on this list, but I was able to speak with some folks about Evergreen Square and how we might improve that parking lot for event spaces and things like that. With that, I would love to turn it over to council and listen to your discussions and answer any questions if you have any.
Okay, thanks, Jeff. Thanks, Troy. Can I open with one question for Troy as a clarification?
Absolutely.
On I-976, you mentioned $2 billion. That's $2 billion of state money, not counting the local effects. Is that correct?
So I saw OFM's fiscal. I looked at that earlier this morning, and I believe that figure included both, but I'm not 100% sure on that. I can get you the chart, Mr. Mayor, and we could route that around. But I think, I know Joe might know more about this than I do, but I think that's roughly the number. And I think that it includes municipalities. However, I don't think that Shelton wouldn't be impacted directly, because I think the car tabs are
Right.
not part of the discussion here.
Correct.
They weren't on the list of cities that I saw that would be directly impacted.
Okay, thanks. Okay.
And just to follow up on that, we were able to clarify that it does not have a nexus with sales tax with our transportation benefit district.
That's correct. It's only targeting car tabs and would
Only.
not affect our sales tax.
Correct.
To the extent that if projects don't move forward, obviously you get local and state sales tax off of those, but that's sort of a cascading effect that's pretty hard to quantify at this point.
Okay. Further discussion or clarification?
If I may, one other item that we discussed in briefings is if there's any capacity to look at some sort of coalition or funding mechanism to support jail services and particularly jail infrastructure. Recently, we had a joint meeting with the county, and one of the things that came out of that was an understanding that many cities and counties across the state are facing a real issue with not having capacity or modern facilities. And it sounds as though a lot of that has to do with timing of the last time these were built was all state funded, and now there's an epidemic essentially of failing infrastructure across the state. So is there any capacity to partner with other cities or other counties to hopefully mitigate that issue, or at least shine a light on it and see what our opportunities might be there?
So if I remember correctly, I think the last time the state participated in the jail building boom, that was back in about 2005. And you had all this revenue pouring into the state, and you had a huge, the bond model produced a huge number that they could spend. And I know they were shoving money out the door, and that was way before my time. And I think that they spent a considerable amount. But since then, I think the state has been reluctant to do that just for creating the precedent. The thing that is very limiting this go-around is that $70 million figure to go around for the whole state. And I have not heard of any new initiatives, but I know that that's an interest for this community, and we're on the lookout all the time for revenue streams that could possibly help out. I think you would be, your case would be strengthened tremendously if we had some sort of cooperation with the county on that, because it's obviously a joint venture.
Councilmember Schmidt?
So kind of knowing the spending tolerance right now, it's just very little. Looking at, I definitely, every morning I drive by the 101 Fish Passage culvert project. I think of that gateway through downtown. And maybe instead of looking at that, we look at like a preliminary design funding for that or something along those lines. But I look at the kind of a missed opportunity with that project going on right now when all that dirt's being moved to not be simultaneously working on something else. But at least start the design, kick the tires on that. I'd like to look at that one.
Other input?
Jeff, has there been any feedback from the county as to whether there's any appetite for pursuing a joint project in that manner?
There has been, we've had discussions with them about a cooperative lobbying agreement, and that's morphed a little bit over time, but we are still discussing cooperating with local partners in order to better benefit the citizens in the community. More people at the table is always better for us than just us alone.
And I would remiss not to also just state, and I'm in full agreement with, prioritizing the homelessness issues, the jail issues much higher than the gateway projects. But again, looking at different funding sources, being the transportation budget for that particular project versus capital budget for those. I just didn't want to downplay my support on that front. So.
That brings up a good point. I would be remiss if I didn't state that much like we did in 2017, if there are projects that you want to prioritize that don't naturally fit into one of these two budgets, we'd be happy to take a look at those and explore some alternative grant programs or revenue sources. You may remember when we first started this venture, I brought in Meg Van Schorl with Gordon Thomas Honeywell, and she's an expert at some of those alternative funding sources, and I would be willing to bring her in to help me out that 4 or 5 different projects, even if you came up with that list that maybe didn't fit into that traditional budget area. And of course, that wouldn't cost you guys anything more. I would do that and bring Meg in for my own benefit, but just something to keep in mind as you put your list together.
Question on it's going to be a county project, but the jail. In recent history, has there been much support, I assume, in the capital budget for county or even local jail facilities?
I think it's been pretty limited since the big boom about 20 years ago, 15, 20 years ago. Again, I think I would have to go through all the lists, but I know that individual legislators have been successful in getting small pieces here and there, mostly for improvements or repairs rather than big new facilities. It's just not something that they've done through the capital budget. And again, the needs that Shelton has are not unique. You can see this thing repeating itself all across the state. And if the state sets a precedent for funding those big ticket items, there won't be bond capacity left for schools or other things of that nature.
Jeff, do you want to address the latecomers agreement? Because
Sure.
It sounded like you were not real optimistic. Is that a fair statement, or do you want to?
The way I like to look at this particular issue is, all I can say is no. So we might as well ask. I think that the latecomers agreement that we have currently with Washington State Patrol is a limiting factor in our economic development along that corridor. I think it would be wise use of tax dollars to enhance our ability to develop along that corridor, both today and in the future. But it is also a large ticket. Troy and his colleagues at Philip Burgess has looked into this a little bit, and really the only mechanism to address it at this point, well, there's two. One would be to renegotiate the agreement, which at the moment, I'm not sure what the incentive would be for WSP to renegotiate. There, we would have to offer something, and what that something is, I don't know. And two, or to a direct appropriation to basically reduce the debt at this point. But I see that as one of our major issues in economic development in the future, particularly along that corridor with all the vacant and available land ready for building. So I think it would be remiss not to at least ask and find out what the possibilities are.
Thanks.
Jeff, just one more thing. One other discussion point that we have had, sitting on the RIA 14 board, some Hearst money. It has been identified as a project for RIA 14 through the Hearst decision and the money that's available through that. It is a discussion point that we have identified a potential project to eliminate those two. I did bring that up just last meeting, this last Thursday. That was a discussion point that we had with that entire committee. So maybe another source of funding to eliminate that.
And I saw a lot of nodding on the latecomers discussion, so I'll go ahead and do some outreach to Ways and Means appropriation staff to even see if that's a feasible or politically practical ask for the operating budget, for the supplemental operating budget. As Jeff said, it never hurts to ask. I've never done anything like that before, so we'll see if it's something that we can even pursue come January.
Okay. Go ahead, Councilmember.
And maybe just kind of a more of a logistic or procedural type thing. We had discussed this a little bit, but I think as a council, we're definitely looking to be more engaged this legislative session and from here on out. And one suggestion is to kind of via Jeff, maybe get like when session is moving here, get kind of like a weekly roll up if there's significant information to pass along and any opportunities that you, Troy or Jeff, see to have the council in Olympia or council members, certain council members in Olympia to either testify in support of or whatever your advisement would be. I think, again, we want to play a more active role than we may have had in the past, so.
Yeah, and Troy does provide a weekly wrap-up, and the idea would be just to forward that along to council members with my thoughts as those come in during the session.
Yeah, I'm assuming you guys all
Yeah,
still
I think
agree with that.
I think it's a
so.
good idea. Okay.
Yeah, typically on budget requests, less is more, and a lot of times, I don't know if you've ever watched a capital budget hearing or a transportation budget hearing on the actual budget, but it's literally a cattle call of people coming in. And so having council members or staff testify might not be the best use of your time. But if we do get into these more issue-oriented debates and we talk about the latecomers and some other things, there may be opportunities, and I won't be shy. I'll definitely ask for your help in testifying in support or in opposition to whatever we need.
Okay. Thanks, Troy.
I just have a question. So do you, if you hear about a grant for tasers for the police or metal detectors for the courts, do you bring that to Jeff? And if you hear about stuff like that in Olympia?
Yeah, there's been a couple of those recently, and before I usually would pass them along to your economic development coordinator, but I know he's moved along, and so now I will send those to Jeff directly. But yeah, as opportunities like that arise, particularly for law enforcement, there's been a few grant programs that have had application timelines closing. So yeah, I pass those along, and he forwards them to the appropriate folks.
Okay.
So We've got a few more minutes. I just want to make sure that as we put the resolution together, that the council's on board with what we had laid out. The policy related issue with homelessness on Martin v. Boise, to see if there's a consensus on how to legally deal with that, those constraints. And then construction dollars for a potential shelter location to be determined at a later date in cooperation with the community, and operational dollars to either fund that shelter and/or produce a case manager to work in concert with our police department to identify those issues, build relationships, and help coordinate the various nonprofit service providers already located in the city.
I'll speak for myself. I think the coordination and immediate operational support from a caseworker would be top priority in my, because long-term, and then you said with community, and I'm taking that, including the county, if we're talking about an actual shelter, that would be critical to me, that the city would be cooperating with the county.
Absolutely.
Yeah, that's my feeling.
Absolutely.
Okay. So any other things we should be thinking about or that we missed as we put the resolution together for your consideration and approval, probably mid-October?
Not at this time.
Seeing none?
Great.
That give you enough to go on?
Now I feel bad for asking Troy to race through there, race through his PowerPoint.
I did hit 15 minutes, pretty close.
You did.
And then I think we would try to get together with our delegation prior to session, as we've done in the last year or two.
So one of the things that I've thought about that I've seen work well in the past is a legislative breakfast where we put together our proposals, our legislative agenda, and then we have a breakfast meeting with our delegation to discuss what those are, those priorities are. And sit down with Troy and basically discuss those priorities and why there are priorities. So with council's concurrence, we'll go ahead and get that scheduled and find out when each of our delegation members are available.
That sounds like a great plan to me. Yeah. Okay.
And then if I, just one bit of a compliment to the council. I know the work session that we had at the conclusion of last session, and then at all the ribbon cuttings, you all do a very good job of thanking the delegation for their support and participation, because frankly, a lot of the projects that we have received wouldn't happen without the delegation. And so I just want to commend you, because you do a good job of making them feel appreciated. A state legislator's job is hard, and they usually hear a lot more complaints than they do compliments. So keep up the good work on that. And we do need to nurture that asset, because I know not all legislative districts have the benefit of a delegation that works as closely together as ours does, and that definitely plays in our favor. So thank you for indulging them and letting them know they're appreciated.
Thank you, Troy. Anything else?
I think that's it, Mr. Mayor.
All right, we'll adjourn our our study session.